Hi, everybody. We'll just wait a couple more minutes to kind of allow for everyone to get on and get settled in for a few minutes, and we'll begin. As everybody is popping on, I just want to reiterate something that I put in the chat that tonight, to receive your CE credits, completion of a post-event evaluation is required. So check your email after the event and you'll get all of those details. All right, we will go ahead and get started. Um, First, I definitely want to thank everyone for coming this evening. It's really exciting to be able to be a part of this initiative, Learn with Wellbrook. I definitely have to give a shout out to Joy Wax. She has put so much time and energy and love and just compassion into this project. And I feel very honored to start this up for Wellbrook as the first presenter. So thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to talk tonight about understanding trauma and its impact on mental health. So I wanted to, just let everyone know that today is, about reframing a trauma-informed nervous system-based understanding of behavior, coping, and recovery, and just talking about how, we want to understand these patterns and why the patterns persist, as well as how healing happens. And not to kind of go into like labels or diagnosis, but more just for true understanding and a big focus on healing. So, to go over the objectives as far as those go for today's educational experience, we're going to, define trauma. We're also going to explain the neurobiology of the mechanisms involved with trauma. And we're also going to talk about some, common trauma responses. We're going to link trauma with addiction issues, and we're going to review evidence-based treatment options for trauma. And, I'm excited to kind of go into some other aspects of trauma that aren't really talked about a lot, when we do discuss it and see if we can, get any conversations or questions going. So, like I said in the chat, I'll pause about every 15 minutes or so for chat questions. So if you have anything or any comments, definitely pop on there. I, it's very interesting to present on a webinar or Zoom instead of in person. So, we'll go through this together. All right. So first, as we are defining trauma, wanting to, note trauma is not defined solely by the event. It's how the nervous system experiences and responds to that event. And, I think that when we're defining trauma, two people, can have the same experience, the same situation, and have very different outcomes of that situation, based upon how their nervous system, how their body, reacts to that. And trauma often shows up later in behavior, in emotions, in relationships, definitely in addiction. And, just trying to make sure that we really look at it as, you know, from the mental health and well-being aspect of it, and the nervous system specifically, as we're doing tonight. So as far as the neurobiology of trauma, I really like to explain a lot of the times to my clients, how the brain in and of itself has these sections to it. And when we are treating trauma, we're looking at the neurobiology of the fact that trauma is in the amygdala, right? It is in the reactive part of your brain. And when we're treating trauma, we're trying to get it over to your prefrontal cortex and trying to get it to where we can reprocess it, or cognitively process it because that was disrupted during the traumatic event. So, you know, in your amygdala, it is, it's the part of your brain that just does. It just reacts based upon what your body is telling it, what your nervous system is telling it. And, this is the part where your amygdala controls, things like digestion or things, like blinking, just all of these things that it just automatically does. And so your fear response activation is in this section as well. And so once your amygdala sees something, your fear response is activated. And we'll talk about, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, in a moment. But at that point, all of the blood flow goes to your amygdala. So your prefrontal cortex kind of goes offline, right? It takes a break because it wants to give all of its energy over to your amygdala, over to protecting you, over to keeping you safe. And so as it's doing that, your brain, it does the reactive part. It does the part of the amygdala that is going to tell it to react, to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And then it just, at that point though, it does not know time, right? Amygdalas don't know time. It doesn't understand that that traumatic event is over. And so it gives you, a lot of hypervigilance. It gives you a lot of anxiety. It gives you, all of these feelings in your nervous system, all of these feelings in your body somatically that you're experiencing. And because it doesn't know time, and because of the fact that cognitively you don't, you're not putting, your body's not putting together, um, that you're not in this situation any longer, these traumatic triggers can come back to you after any period of time. So let's say, for example, right, you are, you're being chased by a bear, right? And your amygdala turns on and it says, like, I'm going to start running. I'm going to use the flight, of this trauma response. And, you get into the cabin, you're safe, you're good to go. So afterwards, you're anxious, you're hypervigilant, your heart rate's going up, your body has like a lot of tension in it, and potential some stomach issues, things like that. Well, later, let's say it's 6 days, 6 months, 6 years, you're in a cabin. Doesn't even have to be the same cabin, and you go out, and the tree that you go out and see with your sight, or the smell that you have somatically, or any of these somatic ways your senses know to mirror, right, a triggering aspect of that event, your body is going to be triggered, and your amygdala gets hijacked, which I know we've all heard, that phrase before. And your body is going to react in that same way, because of the fact that it wasn't processed. It wasn't processed, and it wasn't cognitively, part of your brain at that time. So, just trying to look at it from, again, the neurotransmitters, imbalancing those stress chemicals, the brain structure, changing um, from a quick stress to more of a prolonged stress, and focusing on that memory processing disruption, which again we will discuss later on in the slides. So you know again, when we think about trauma, we always have to really reflect upon the fact that trauma impacts the brain from the bottom up. And, with the amygdala driving that threat detection, the hippocampus struggles to organize that memory. That prefrontal cortex, that part that is responsible for that logic, that impulse control, because it goes offline, we just, it explains why we, like, the insight alone doesn't resolve the trauma response. Just understanding that you're not in danger anymore, just that cognitive notion of it, that it's not the same event, doesn't just solve that response because it's stuck in that reactive part of your brain. Okay. So then I want to talk about epigenetics. I want to talk about um, how epigenetics, it refers to gene expression. And in this gene expression, there are tags in your DNA. And when your tags are experiencing something such as cortisol, and the cortisol is increased in your body, there's a stressful event, there's a traumatic event, it changes gene expression that occurs without altering your DNA. So, trauma, chronic stress, neglect, it can influence which of these genes are turned on and off. Um, and, as that's happening, trauma, it doesn't pass the memory down genetically. However, it can pass the stress sensitivity, and it can be transmitted biologically. It can be transmitted relationally. Environmental pathways that are creating this space. So, it's not a destiny. It's just that, healing and regulation can interrupt this cycle. And so what we're trying to do is help, clients understand that epigenetically they were predisposed, potentially to have these markers, flipped on. Maybe again, it's a cortisol marker. And the thing is that when these are turned on in your body, and let's say, for example, it's a female, and this female is pregnant, and she's pregnant with a girl. All of the eggs that are actually in utero, right, in her baby that she is, carrying at that moment, all of the egg genetic markers turn on with that cortisol marker epigenetically. And so you're passing along throughout generations in generational trauma experiencing this. And it goes back so far, it can go back 57 generations. And there's even studies that talk about how Holocaust victims generationally can pass on so much of their stress, so much of their trauma that they have been through, to where it can be seen as 17% more likely for several generations later for their family members to have PTSD. And so it just shows you, how strong epigenetics can be, how strong, genetically, these things can be passed through. So, um, just going to check the chat, just to make sure it doesn't look like there is any questions so far. So I will keep going. So now, let's talk about trauma responses. Just as an overview, we know that fight or flight responses are, some of the most commonly talked about responses. So, they may show up as anger or control. They could, flight, as far as fight goes. Flight could show up like avoidance or restlessness. And not like character flaws, right? But just protective responses that your body is giving you and protective responses that it's, projecting out from your amygdala and from just that reactive aspect. And then, as we look forward to, freeze and fawn, the freeze response is, it's shutting down, it's numbness, it's disassociation. It's, when people just feel like they can't articulate, reaching out. They can't process the overwhelmed. They can't work through that stress or anxiety. They feel completely shut down. Whereas the fawn response, is a lot of people pleasing behavior. It's appeasing to maintain safety. So, for example, if you had a client that, had a potential, marital discourse, and in this, in this marriage, the husband would be abusive verbally, right? If the wife wasn't doing things and such as maybe just even making dinner by 5 p.m., getting dinner on the table, making sure the house was picked up, making sure that the kids had done their homework, things like that. She would, the fawn response is, making sure that she has everything perfectly, everything exactly how it should be, everything that it needs to be, so she wouldn't get yelled at, so she wouldn't be verbally abused. She's trying to do everything in her power to create, this people pleasing just to maintain her safety, just to, you know, again, a lot of times this is relational trauma, this is attachment trauma, and things that, again, are passed down or things that have been progressively shown in their attachment systems, which we can discuss later as well. Okay. So when it comes to trauma and addiction, that's definitely something that, in our experience, especially at Wellbrook, being that we are an addiction recovery center, we see just so much of. And in this aspect, it's a very bi-directional relationship with addiction, with trauma. It's very hard to notice. It's sort of like the chicken or the egg situation, right? Which came first? Could it be, the trauma that developed these addictive behaviors as coping mechanisms, or was it the substance use putting these clients in these situations where trauma was much more likely to be happening, whether it be environmentally, socially, experiences like that. So it's always really, important to kind of recognize that bidirectional relationship. We talk about it a lot when we discuss things like, the biopsychosocial, cultural assessments where we are looking at the whole picture, right? We're looking at the biology of it, the epigenetics of it. We're looking at, the intergenerational trauma of it. We're also looking at psychologically, what are we experiencing as far as dual diagnosis? Then we're looking at things like socially, what type of environments are our clients in? What type of childhood did they have? What type of, childhood patterns did they have in their lives? And so, really trying to look at the whole picture and, just recognizing that over time, trauma can be intensified with symptoms. This is why, integrating trauma and addiction treatment is so essential. Finding out, what the root cause is of the addiction versus just focusing on, from the top down coping or from the top down, just the addiction itself. And, later on, in the presentation, we'll also discuss, how important it is to recognize things like dual diagnosis in this regard because of what, trauma can do and what different mental health diagnosis can do when it comes to treating. So. Okay. So, because of the fact, right, that we're talking a lot about coping, we're talking about nervous system regulation, you know, rather than viewing, dual diagnosis as two separate problems, this framework helps us understand, co-occurring symptoms, I'm sorry, as different expressions of nervous system dysregulation. So, coping behaviors, emerging to, restore safety, trying to get to that safety point and getting back into control. Symptoms that are, downstream signals, not the root of the problem. So, being that trauma does disrupt the nervous system's ability to self-regulate. Substances, behaviors often function as coping mechanisms to manage all of the dysregulation. And, dual diagnosis represents attempts to restore that safety, that relief, get that control back, and trying to really see the framework as it is, right? And kind of see the progression of the trauma, the coping, and the nervous system regulation. So we'll look at that in this next slide. Okay. So, another way to look at it is the trauma, the coping, and the nervous system regulation as, as a continuum. So we have this this nervous system dysregulation, so some type of trauma exposure, chronic stress, or attachment disruption. It goes into a coping strategy, right? It could be, substance abuse, it could be avoidance, it could be like shut down, withdraw, it could be the emotional numbing, it could be control-based behaviors. And those coping strategies then show the symptoms. So that's when we're going to be looking at anxiety and depression, addiction and relapse, relationship issues, sleep issues, chronic health issues. And, these symptoms they're signals of dysregulation. They're not the root of the problem. And so, if we're not addressing the trauma, if we're not addressing the root of the issue, the root of the problem, then these nervous system dysregulations are just going to keep happening over and over. And then it's going to be that cycle that is just a total continuation. And so, you know, wanting to point out that, it helps us stay curious. It helps us, stay out of like judgmental spaces and helps us understand with curiosity, like, when we talk about this with clients too, it's like, why am I the way I am? Right? Why am I coping this way? Why am I behaving in this manner? Why are these, dual diagnosis symptoms coming up? And, you know, trying to trace it backwards into what type of trauma they were exposed to. And, when we're talking about things from the ground up, it's just so pivotal, to our clients instead of just constantly, top down managing their symptoms because, I think that a lot of them are just used to, well, I have these symptoms, right? So I'm just going to manage them. I'm just going to try to cope with them the best that I can. And a lot of times, with our clients, that equals addictive patterns. And a lot of times, the relapse occurs when they get a trauma trigger, not even, right? A trigger that happens with, some type of maybe trigger at the gas station or a trigger at, dinner with a bar in the background or something of that nature at a restaurant. It could just be not just, but it could be a trauma trigger that is, again, it's dysregulating them at that moment. And they, what they're used to doing when they're dysregulated like that is coping with substance use. And so then they just revert back, a relapse happens, and the cycle continues again. So if we're not really tackling the roots, if we're not really looking at this as, a left to right, um, aspect, you know, then we're not, inevitably, it's going to be the same results. And so, really pointing out to clients, really pointing out as clinicians, group therapy, safe connection equals nervous system regulation. And focusing on the safety in that and the um, just the camaraderie of that. For us, it's in Chardon, we are male only. And so, it really comes up a lot in like a brotherhood aspect and liked minds and, shared experiences. Just going to take a peek at the chat again. It looks like we're still clear. Okay. So, next, I'd like to talk about the window of tolerance and readiness for trauma processing. So this is very key when it comes to the actual treatment. We want to ensure that our clients, are not in that state of hyperarousal, not with, having that anxiety, the panic, the agitation. So we have to look at, where are they at in their window of tolerance? And so when we think about that and um, we think about like an optimal time, an optimal, space. It's when they are within the window so they can remain regulated, they can remain present, they can go through this process and they can narrow in on the trauma while not, going into maybe a panic attack or an anxiety attack or a major depressive episode. And so, just incredibly important to, look at ensure that they are not, hyper aroused, like with anxiety or agitation. Make sure they're not hypo aroused, like shutdown or numbness, and making sure that they are within their window so that way the trauma processing can occur. There's going to be so many parts of them that are going to try to protect them. There's going to be secondary gains. There's going to be these aspects of them that are so used to living the way that they've lived for so long and, kind of like being the way that they've been for so long that their brain just gets very comfy in that. And so we want to make sure that, you know, they are able to cope, that they are able to, in a healthy way, get to this space where we can effectively treat the trauma and, you know, focus on the fact that it's a slippery slope, right? Because you have this window and you have this time frame to be able to process this. But sometimes, because of the trauma, the clients are so hyper aroused or hypo aroused that it takes them a bit to get into this space to be able to process it. And so it gets very tricky. And, we'll talk about EMDR as, an effective treatment in a little bit, but it's, incredibly important to resource your clients in the most effective ways due to the fact that, they're not going to be able to get through this. They're not going to be able to effectively have this treated unless, they are in their window. So always pointing out, connection as regulation, always pointing out co-regulation, safety, and really trying to be consistent with that. So I definitely, being an attachment-based therapist, I think it's incredibly crucial to discuss attachment trauma, isolation, and addiction. And especially because of the fact that attachment is truly the first trauma that these clients are experiencing. Attachment is, it's built within those first, from infancy all the way to, 4 or 5 years old from your primary caregiver. And so, from an attachment perspective, if your clients are not getting their needs met, right, 80% of the time, then they are going to develop an insecure attachment. And those insecure attachments being, of course, anxious, avoidant, or fearful, disorganized in children, fearful in adults, are going to kind of point you to the directions of sort of what happened in their childhood. Was their childhood inconsistent? Was their needs were met? They had everything that they needed 80% of the time, right? And remember, when we talk about attachment, we're not talking about, Maslow's hierarchy of needs as your basic needs being met, right? We're not talking about things like shelter and food and water. We are talking about a safe connection. We're talking about when your baby's crying and you go and you pick them up and you're tending to their needs because the only way their system knows how to regulate when they are in infancy is to co-regulate with a caregiver. They used to talk about when my kids were young, aging myself 20 years ago, they talked about, the cry it out method. They talked about, they'll learn to self-soothe. And, in the past a decade or so, attachment has just become incredibly crucial to understand, especially for our addiction clients, because, you know, if they're not taught to co-regulate from infancy, then how on earth do we expect them, to regulate themselves without the use of substances? So we get down to, how that shapes their nervous system, how that gives them expectations for connection. Um, and so, with anxious attachment, for example, dad goes to T-ball game, 3 times in a row, and he's there and it's great, and you have that safe connection. Then all of a sudden he says he's going to be there, but twice in a row he's not there. And so again, maybe the next game he's there, the next two he's not. It's that back and forth, right? It's that anxiety of knowing what it's like to have that safe connection, but not knowing when you're going to get it back. And your system experiencing that anxiety, experiencing like what's going to happen today. Am I going to have that safety system, on the sidelines, or am I not? Then we talk about things like avoidant attachment. And these are the kids that, they were by themselves a lot. They were taught to sort of fend for themselves. They were taught to, maybe this is an only child. Maybe this is, a child that, um, you know, was maybe dismissed to his room or the backyard or something of that nature. But he didn't see connection as the ability and the capability to, build safety with another human. He just relied on himself. And so an adult, right, would then just not even seek out connection because we can do it ourselves. We've done it ourselves this whole time. Asking for help and not receiving it would just be disappointment. It would, spark some type of, abandonment, some type of neglect. And so avoiding that connection altogether. Then we talk about fearful attachment and, the unfortunate circumstance of the fact that, when we're talking fearful and we're talking about abuse, right? And so your caretaker was not only the source of love, but it was also the source of some type of abusive behavior. And in that, it gets very, very confusing for the child because they long for the love, but then they're terrified because their caregiver is also the abuser. So they don't know what they're going to get at any given moment. So that's how it becomes very disorganized for them as children. And then as adults, it becomes fearful. And it could be, a bit of a mix with, anxious attachment and avoidant attachment in that because of the fact that, again, you're not sure what you're going to get with a connection. So do you try it? Do you anxiously attach to it once you do get it? And then inevitably drive it away, right? By anxious behaviors and potential symptoms of being just I always say like a stage 5 clinger. um, you know, uh, Always worrying about did you do something wrong? Did you say something wrong? Did you do something to make someone angry? And, having that anxiety that it was you that caused some type of friction and you're holding on really, really tight. Um, so or is it that, they are a source of abandonment or a source of fear and you just avoid it altogether? You avoid feeling that way again. You avoid feeling hurt again. You avoid just anything that could include pain. And so in our clients' cases, substances become a substitute for connection by temporarily soothing that attachment related stress. So, in that, you have to have three things in order to have a safe connection. You have to have reliability, availability, and you have to have emotional, some type of emotional connection, emotional regulation. And so, with our clients, this so often happens where that's their substance. That's what they attach to and substitute because it's readily available, it's reliable, and it's helping their emotions. It's helping their nervous system. So they don't have to regulate because the substances are doing that for them. Um, and so, in our clients' aspects, this is often our clients' best attempt at that self-regulation, um, trying to get their dopamine in check, trying to get their serotonin in check, trying to get their GABA in check, because they don't know how to regulate those those chemicals in their bodies any other way. And, a lot of the times too, when we talk about attachment trauma, isolation, and addiction, it's, because of the fact that it temporarily replaces that connection, recovery is about restoring those safe relationships. It's, I say this, and a lot of the times, during groups, our clients have over unders on how many times I say it in a group, but attachment, you know, just shows you that connection is the opposite of addiction. And it shows you that, you know, when you're in active addiction, you're isolating, you are alone, you don't want to depend on another human because you've had so much disappointment in those connections. And so a lot of, what is needing to be focused on is building that secure connection, building that safe space again, because it's just not something that they've had for a very, very long time, sometimes decades. So. Right. Going to, oops, move on to the next slide. Okay. So now that we've talked about, a lot of, the background of trauma, the neurobiology of trauma, some of the aspects of addiction, some of the aspects of, um, obviously regulation as well as attachment, we need to start focusing on treatment, right? We have all of this understanding, have all of this education, but like, what do we do with it? How do we heal it? And so, a first use, is commonly CBT, and cognitive behavioral therapy absolutely, employs clients, with structured techniques to identify, change negative thought patterns, reframe, and truly try to help them manage their symptoms. But it's insufficient on its own for trauma because of the fact that nervous system dysregulation is not addressed. Trauma is not in your cognition. And so if you're trying to manage it with cognitive therapy, it's not even there to be able to manage, right? It's part of your nervous system, it's part of your amygdala, it's part of your reactive part of your brain. So again, as we are or we're using reprocessing tools, we're using trauma-based modalities, CBT absolutely has its place. And, it absolutely has its place to help with things like the window of tolerance to ensure that our clients, are trying to, on an everyday in an everyday space, be able to reframe things, be able to manage maybe triggers or, manage life, in general. But as a form of, trauma therapy, it's just not, it's not effective, in that aspect. So, okay. So next we want to talk about EMDR, which is, as we know, a very kind of, uh, popular, newer, I guess, to some extent, form of therapy. And, I love discussing EMDR now that I'm an EMDR trained clinician because it's truly, I think, one of the techniques that is just honestly beautiful. And it is so cool to be able to see, these targeted, unprocessed traumatic memories and us being able, we're going to dive into the details of it, but being able to move it into this adaptive processing space. To disrupt that natural memory integration that had happened, that natural space that it got stuck in the amygdala. And with EMDR, we can help restart that adaptive processing so memories can be stored without that ongoing distress. We can, bring them back into that present day safety. So, you know, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, focuses on, just that. It focuses on processing traumatic memories through guided either eye movements and bilateral stimulation. And so, if you're doing this, I mean, some clients, even in person, will use an eye movement like a ball on the screen or maybe a pen or a pencil being, swiped back and forth. In person, you can have things. I use like tappers, and they'll give, a buzzing sensation that will go in a right, left, right, left, right, left pattern pretty quickly and, for an extended period of time. And in that, we've learned that it doesn't necessarily have to be eye movement. It just has to be a bilateral movement. And so, using the tappers, you can actually have them, in the client's hands. You can have them put them underneath their thighs. You can put them in their pockets. A lot of the times in EMDR with children, they'll like put them in their shoes, and they can even have like integrated play therapy at the same time. So it's really cool, just how much, progress EMDR therapy has made over the years, from its original thought process. I do think, it's very cool to be able to understand that, we're going to talk about nature therapy in a little bit as well as another amazing tool for trauma therapy. But the fact that, the bilateral movements were first thought of from the eye movement aspect, right? From the aspect of a therapist walking through the woods and, trying to clear her head and bilaterally walking, using that motion and scanning nature. And in that, right, she had thought about REM sleep, thought about the eye movement during REM sleep and that rapid eye movement, right? And what happens to your brain as far as processing when you're sleeping. And, EMDR was born. And so you're literally trying to, therapeutically take these memories in the body, these somatic memories, these reactive memories, and you're trying to desensitize this client from these memories by disrupting the brain's natural information processing system. Or I'm sorry, that's what trauma does. Trauma disrupts the brain's natural information processing system. So when those unprocessed memories are stored, in isolation with those original emotions, beliefs, body sensations, all of the somatic aspects of it, those current triggers are, that's as if that trauma is still going. So EMDR facilitates reprocessing so memories can be integrated adaptively because of the fact that it was disrupted in the first place. And those symptoms revolve as information is, brought in to present day safety. So that could be a lot of times I like to, pair up like parts work with it. I like to pair up attachment work with it. And it's just incredibly effective you know, to kind of take care of childhood wounds or other traumas that have happened at other parts of life, and you can feasibly, dive into those memories. And if you're integrating parts work, your present day self, right, client's present day self, can feasibly be in and a part of that memory to help them understand that this isn't right now, right? This isn't present day, and reprocess it in a way where it brings them to that current day safety. I'm seeing some questions pop up, so I'm going to go over to that. So, how is it discovered that bilateral movement affects PTSD? Um, so, oh, hold on. Okay, so one person said, in my opinion, it's why people turn to their phones. Absolutely. I think that, it's definitely an issue with phones and we've known and understood, right, like that the even the lights that are given off on phones are mirroring anxiety and they are producing, that anxious, repetitious aspect. We're learning things like TikTok and, Reels are doing things to our brain as far as like patience levels and even just like ability to focus. It's really disrupting quite a bit. So let's say, so how is it discovered that bilateral movements affect PTSD? So the very first, um, I'm trying to remember when it was. I want to say the 60s, but when she very first recognized that this walk and scanning nature was helping her process, was helping her clear her head, was helping her kind of get back to that present moment, it was then researched with war veterans and that type of PTSD, right? That type of PTSD was the original intention and the original. Oh, thank you so much, 1987, Liz. Um, so that was the original intention was to help war veterans so that way they could get through their PTSD from being in combat, from being in active combat. And I think that's also where a lot of the times, we always discuss, big T, little t trauma at Wellbrook and just the importance of recognizing that so many people, viewed trauma as PTSD. They viewed trauma as you could only have trauma if you were a war veteran, if you were, a veteran in general, and you were in some type of active combat. And the fact is that there are so many forms of trauma. And, clinically, we say big T, little t. I think, when I was in grad school, they talked about trying to do away with that because we're not trying to minimize, right, the experience of little t trauma. But those are traumas, such as getting fired from a job, divorce. It could be finding out about infidelity. It could be financial struggle. It could be, an experience for you that was traumatic, but for someone else that is, thank you, Francine Shapiro. Um, for you, that for someone else, it was completely different. So, you know, yes. Okay. So, a couple things on the chat. Liz, thank you so much for your backup and your help. Um, Francine Shapiro was the woman who initially came up with EMDR. And yes, I mean, I completely agree. I think that, Joseph said that this subject is absolutely fascinating. I agree. I always say I love trauma because of the fact that it can be healed. And I tell my clients it sounds funny when you say you love trauma, but it's just because of the fact that it can be healed and you can grow and you can be more adaptive in your coping, and you can be more adaptive and not turn to things like substances when you're working on your attachment trauma, when you're working on, these aspects. So, there was one more question. What does literature say on the effects of EMDR compared to prolonged exposure and its treatment of trauma? Is one more effective than the other? So we're going to talk about prolonged exposure therapy. I actually have a really cool case study before I became EMDR trained for that. And, I don't know that answer. I don't know about the research in comparison. I do know that, prolonged exposure therapy is incredibly effective. And I think that, when we were getting trained in EMDR, they talk about the fact that it's the fastest way to heal trauma, right? And by fastest, truly it just depends on the client. It depends on the trauma. It depends on the depth of the trauma. And if we're talking about complex trauma, if we're talking about compounded trauma, if we're talking about, multiple aspects of PTSD, mixed in with, potential history of abuse, or maybe it is, combat, things like that. So I think it's all in my perspective. Again, I have not researched it as far as comparison, but I know that the effectiveness of EMDR and the quickness of how you can move through that tunnel. They call it like this, the EMDR tunnel, how long you're in there and how long you're reprocessing versus, prolonged exposure therapy, which, can take several months or years. It just, it truly depends on the case, on the situation, and on, how their nervous system was affected and how far back their nervous system was affected. So. But yes, I agree though that, EMDR in general is just, it's one of the most fascinating things. And I was actually, self-disclosure, I was going through EMDR myself, for some trauma that I was experiencing. And, um, it's when I called our CEO right away and I was like, I have to get trained in this. This is just, it's remarkable, just the effects of it after a couple of sessions. And, this was before I was even through my first tunnel, before I was even through, my first memory that I was working on. So yes, definitely a very cool aspect. Um, Yes, Liz, I agree. I thank you. Liz says that I really like how you said all trauma can be healed. I think people get confused and can easily disagree with the statement because when they think heal, they think goes away. And that's just not the case. Trauma healing is really nervous system integration, like you've been saying, it's combining bottom up body sensory and top down cognitive narrative processing. And it's all of that. And it's, when we talk about it with our clients, it's a lot of work, you know. Excuse me. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of really, really hard work. And, even going through it myself, it's work that it gets worse before it gets better, and that's really hard for some people to really conceptualize and really hard for some people to want to get to that space, right? To really want to get to the space of going through like the hard stuff. And, when we talk about trauma too, at Wellbrook, we talk about the fact that, trauma comes from the Greek word wound. And when your wound is not healed correctly, you know, example, if you break your leg and you don't go get surgery or you don't go, see an orthopedic specialist and your leg heals incorrectly, you know, you do have to you do have to break it. You do have to repair it, right, from the inside out. So when we're talking about trauma, it's important to recognize that we're not re-traumatizing our clients as we are going through things like EMDR or going through things like trauma treatments. That trauma is there. There's no re-traumatizing them. It's already there. It's already this wound that has not been healed. And so what we're doing is we're trying to do it correctly this time because our amygdala, it had our backs. It was, it did the best with what it could, but it got so stuck there that we need to move it out and we need to move it to this adaptive strategy. And so, yeah, I think it's really important to recognize that it doesn't go away. It's not as though you look back at your traumas and or you don't know that they're there anymore or they just disappear, but you recognize that you're here, you're safe, you're okay. And we take these negative distortions about ourselves and we put them into, a more positive light, even as much as, an I'm not good enough to and I am worthy. So, really trying to take these negative cycles and these cognitive distortions and just apply it all, in real time to the present moment, right? Because that's what our clients get so used to, living in the depression of it all, the history of it all, the past of it all, or the anxiety of it all, and they forget to focus on that present moment. And so, it's a really cool way to bring them again just back to that present day safety. So, okay. So exposure therapy and prolonged exposure therapy. So I'll talk about this case study first because it was really very cool to be able to help this client in the way that I did. So I was still in grad school and I was working with a girl who was part of the Sarasota State Fair shooting. And when she was at the shooting, she was with her niece and her nephew. And she has this huge family. She has like 15 nieces and nephews. And but regardless, she was in line at their favorite ride at the fair. And as she was in line, the shooter started shooting. She's the small little thing, and she picked up her 2-year-old and her 10-year-old niece and nephew, and she started running, right? Her flight kicked in her trauma response. And she started running towards the parking lot, not knowing what to do other than maybe I can get these guys to safety. Maybe I can help them get to this point where they can be with other members of the family, just like hoping that other members of the family would kind of have that same idea. So she gets to the parking lot, she gets to their van, and she starts crouching behind the van. And literally the shooters started coming through the parking lot, was like horizontally going in the same direction as her without her knowing, and started shooting in the parking lot. So her agoraphobia was just obviously horrific, and her anxiety. And all she wanted to do was go to prom. So she comes to me her senior year, and she wants to go to prom, and she doesn't even know, right, how she's going to do that. She, is doesn't even have to go to assemblies on Fridays before football games. She doesn't have to go, to any of these like big events or these spaces with a lot of people. So we start off, and we start off with pictures, right? We start off with pictures of like a gymnasium and the prom. We start looking at pictures of even going back as far as a mall or a dress store. And after we looked at the pictures, after we talked about it for a while, when she was ready, her and her mom we have this little like strip mall type area locally to us. And it's like a wedding kind of venue aspect. So it has, wedding dresses and prom dresses, and then it has like tuxedos and then jewelry. And so the idea was for her to go into a really small shop, right? And just try to see if she can stay in there and look at dresses. Then we looked at, after she made it through that aspect, then we went to the local mall, which is, she went into the parking lot aspect of it, didn't go through the mall, right? She was just in the parking lot, went through that door, the parking lot door of like a major department store, and, stayed in there to try to look at dresses and to try to see if she could find something. Then we went to a bigger mall. We went to, and I know there's a lot of people from a lot of different areas, so I won't even go into that. But it was a much, much bigger mall. A lot of different stores, same idea. She did the parking lot. She was able to go from the parking lot right into the department store. Long story short, she progressively was able to get to a space where she found a dress. She bought a dress, and she was so excited. And so then we started going again where she was able to go to a part of, an assembly. It was like an awards assembly. And she was able to then go buy her prom ticket. And at the end of the day, she was able to go to prom, and she stayed for like 45 minutes. And that's all she wanted. She wanted to be able to have that senior experience. And so, you know, it's paced with the client, right? We had to go at her pace. We had to go and make sure that it was very, very gradual. It was repetitious. It was everything, was safe. She was with her safe person, which was her mom. And, you know, because of the fact that it was like talked about, and then it was shown pictures of, and then it was like in real time, it really helped kind of ground her in a therapeutic way. It helped, because we were able to have exercises like breathing techniques, and she was a big fan of square breathing, and she would sit in her car and she would do meditations before she walked in. She would sing songs. She would have like a car dance party, lots of different ways to try to calm down her nervous system before she went in. But it just gave her, that opportunity to do something that she's never done. So, for our exposure therapy at Wellbrook, we're taking the guys to different places that they may have never gone sober. So we're taking them to a restaurant with a bar in the middle. We're taking them to a bowling alley. We're taking them golfing or to Top Golf. We're taking them, to the gas station. Just these different spaces where, they have either never been sober or haven't been sober in these spaces for a really, really long time. And we're exposing them to this in an aspect where they're with the other clients, they're with a behavioral health technician or a clinician, and they're doing it in a safe environment, in a safe space. being monitored, and then they can go back to Wellbrook and discuss this with their therapist, with our lead therapist. And, they can talk about triggers. They can talk about what they experienced in their body. They could talk about like the somatic aspects of it and feasibly, go through several of these types of experiences while they're in treatment. So that way, when they are back out, they can, be able to manage their symptoms, manage their triggers, and, really just do so much better than if they were to go do these things after being in like a treatment bubble, for 60 days and then not having that safety to come back to. So, so yeah, really, really building that and, over time, habits, emotional processing, just decreasing the avoidance of these spaces. And sometimes, again, because of the fact that the trauma just it doesn't necessarily go away, right? Um, Sometimes they do have to change certain things. They do have to, make changes in their life. Socially or environmentally. But this gives them a really good shot at being able to be exposed to a majority of things, um, before they are out on their own going through it by themselves. So, okay. So nature therapy and natural bilateral stimulation, forest bathing. So all some of my absolute next to EMDR, I don't know, it's hard. I have a lot of favorites, but I love the aspect of nature therapy and natural bilateral stimulation. I'm a runner, and so I constantly make um, you know connotations and connections to the fact that I joke I'm not a very good runner. I run for my anxiety. I run to clear my head. And so often we hear things like go on a walk, clear your head. And we don't think about the fact that that rhythmic motion, that walking, that jogging, that running, it mirrors mechanisms used in EMDR. And so, I also teach clients to, use that natural bilateral stimulation with even just like difficult conversations. I'll teach them. I can't, do it in right now and stand up, but I'll teach them like swaying back and forth, right? And tell them, think about when you like are holding a baby and you're in that rocking motion. You're giving that baby that natural bilateral stimulation of easing, right, left, right, left, right, left in this like soft pattern. And it can be very calming for them, if they're doing that type of a movement in maybe a presentation or maybe, talking to someone who makes them really anxious, and just doing that as much as possible, right? Giving them that natural bilateral aspect as much as possible in real life. Um, just supporting the nervous system, right? And supporting aspects that reduce their stress. So obviously nature, we have found, research based, it is incredibly effective as, an intervention for trauma and addiction treatment. It's, just being somatically aware of your surroundings in nature, really embracing, just everything nature has to offer as far as, the smells, the sounds, the sights, things that you can feel, just all these aspects that are part of your nervous system regulation in the first place, part of your somatic experience, and just, being able to really embrace that and be able to reduce, it literally can reduce cortisol levels, rumination, and it's giving that sympathetic nervous system activation. They found, research now that forest bathing and having that emphasis on that like complete immersion in nature promotes parasympathetic activation and it can actually improve your immune system. So just really trying to get them, to getting your clients to try to get everything they possibly can, out of that experience, out of nature. So, clinical case review for this one is very cool. So, one of my grad school teachers, she had this very unfortunate incident with one of her kids, and her son was in the backyard. Um, their dog and the neighbor's dog got in a dog fight, and the oh, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Hold on one second. So Nick says utilizing nature for trauma promotes quiet moments, revitalization, embracing and engaging fresh air, natural rhythms, and we can create a sense of safety that words alone can't. I'm all in. Yes, definitely. Definitely. I would love to be able to just give sessions, on a path or a trail. So much so to where we actually built a trail on our property at Wellbrook. We have 7.5 acres that we sit on, and we built a trail in the backyard to give our lead therapist that option to do sessions on the trail and to do sessions, in nature. And there's something too, right, about that side by side with someone and not having like that the eye contact, right? That aspect where, it's confrontational and you're right in front of them. Whereas when you are processing or when you're having a conversation side by side, it can take a lot of that away. Okay. So back to the case review. Thank you so much, Nick, for that. So back to the case review. So my teacher's son was in the backyard. He had an unfortunate incident where their dog got in a dog fight and his dog was killed by this other dog. And so she did a couple of different things. First, she decided that she was going to, from that moment, for the next several months, they were going to go on walks through their neighborhood. So they were going to use nature therapy as well as natural bilateral stimulation of walking, and use both of those techniques and go take walks, 20-minute walks around the neighborhood every single night. And she was obviously trying, right, to process this trauma with him in real time and allow it not to get stuck, right? Allow those reactions to take a part of that adaptive aspect and continue in real time. So not only were they walking through the neighborhood, but neighborhood dogs were barking, right? They were getting exposed to other dogs. Obviously, he had a lot of moments of freezing, right? Like he did during the dog fight. He had a lot of moments of anxiety. And, she was able to give him, as moms and therapists do, only they can, right? Or dads and therapists, of course. But giving that talk therapy, that natural bilateral movement, that nature therapy, that exposure therapy, combining all of these phenomenal tools to ensure that it didn't get stuck for him. And like it was so exciting because it didn't. By the end of, I think she said 3 months, he was able to go on walks without freezing. He was able to go on walks without having, the shaking, the anxiety, like the look in his eyes when he would hear a dog bark or when he would see a dog in the front of the yard. And so, just having these really cool active ways to, activate nervous system responses in so many aspects. So. All right. So one more case study, and I think that these are so relevant because, it really helps us conceptualize in real time what trauma can do. And in this one, it really, kind of shows you um, time. It shows you how trauma, knows no time. So had a client who was running on a track. And as he was running on a track, his shoe, his cleat, got caught practicing a 4x200 handoff, right? So a relay. So he's running up with a baton and running up to another kid, ready to pass this baton on, right? And as he's running, the kid doesn't go out as fast as he does. And so as fast as he's coming in. And so in this, he, kind of stutter stops, right, a little bit to try to slow down. Well, when he did that, his cleat got caught in the track and the rest of his body propelled forward and snapped back because of his stuck cleat. And he broke his femur completely in half. So really crazy story. Orthopedic surgeon had not seen anything like that in 22 years of practice. Very crazy event. So, at sporting events, if you've ever been to one, you know that, there's an ambulance on the field and that ambulance is always there on the field. So then you have, flashing lights coming on and you have stretchers and you have, this kid in the middle of the field in the track, with a broken leg. So he goes through surgery, gets, long story short, goes through surgery, gets everything, healed the correct way as far as his leg goes. He got a rod, an 18-inch rod, and some pins, and was then going to physical therapy twice a week after being on crutches. It was a I think 3-month long situation, right? And so all he wants to do is be able to, like run in a cross country meet. He wants to be able to, you know, to go to a cross country meet because he's going into his senior year. And he wants to be able to run in at least one of the meets because pretty much his entire season of cross country was going to be, shot from this circumstance and from this incident. So he decides that he doesn't need therapy, that, he's going to weight lift. He's going to, talk to friends. He's going to double up on physical therapy and he's going to be okay. So he's at a football game in August. So this happened in May, okay, beginning of May. And he's at a football game in August, several months later. And as he's standing on the field, watching watching his teammates, or not his teammates, but watching his friends, his peers play football, one of his friends actually breaks his arm. And as this happens, the ambulance comes on the field. The lights turn on, and he goes into a complete freeze state and then has an anxiety attack. Couple weeks go by, and unfortunately, this was a compounded trauma for him because he had actually lost one of his best friends to an epileptic seizure about 6 months before the break. So he's in class, and this is probably October, let's say. And he's in class, and two kids in front of him, the kid falls over and starts seizing on the floor in the classroom. Entire classroom, is evacuated, and the school nurse comes in and the kid's totally okay. He's fine. He came out of it just fine. But this client got into another freeze state. He completely froze when that happened, completely dysregulated, shut down, and then had another anxiety attack. So finally, the tipping point when he decided to go to therapy, get EMDR, was when he was literally just walking. He was walking to class and his shoe, how sometimes sneakers kind of catch a little bit and give you like just a little bit of like a trip, like you're about to trip feeling. And that happened and he dysregulated again automatically. And it was all of these random circumstances happening months and months and months later that, that put him in a position to where he knew that he was traumatized, and this event traumatized him enough to where he needed therapy. He needed EMDR because he didn't want to have to react like that again. So So just, so many aspects and so many ways to look at it and to look at um, how it comes out somatically later, how it comes out with, dysregulation later and the symptoms that it can really produce. So, I think it's really important, with our clients to, focus on things like ethical language, you know, making sure like language matters, words matter, right? And, avoiding like pathologizing survival responses, maintaining boundaries, confidentiality, pacing. This is a very individualized aspect, um, trauma-informed care is ethical care. Trauma-informed, trauma-informed behaviors and just overall persona is just incredibly, incredibly important. I mean, we know it's crucial to, develop a client, clinician relationship. And in so many ways, we're their first safe connection, right? We're their first safe attachment. And being able to emulate this safe space, this safe relationship, and that way they can like project forward in their attachment traumas and in their connections, and in this safe aspect, by being careful to truly to truly in the long run help them heal, and that's what we inevitably want out of all of this is giving them that opportunity, especially when they're vulnerable enough to ask, right? Especially when they're in this state where they're finally able to be honest with themselves and to be vulnerable enough to ask for help, and just having the ability to do that. So I'm gonna check the chat, see if there are any final questions. We have a little less than 10 minutes. I try to save at the end for questions. So please, pop those in if you have any. Um, Make sure, that everybody is checking their email a little bit later on tonight. So that way you can get all the instructions on the survey and get your CE credits, if you have signed up for that. If you've signed up, for the educational piece only, I just really appreciate, your time. I really appreciate you guys, making this space tonight and joining us on, this first initiative that we had on Learning with Wellbrook. There will be more. We're really excited to be able to just have this be the beginning of Learning with Wellbrook, and there's going to be, I want to say April. There's going to be another event, and you can peek at our website, wellbrookrecovery.com, and that will give you all the other CEU events that we're going to be throwing out there for everyone. So, oh, you're very, very welcome. I'm really glad that you guys found it informative. I'm so glad that, you know, you you got some takeaways. That's obviously my hope is for everyone to get a takeaway or two, and just really, focusing on healing isn't about fixing, right? We're not fixing. We are restoring safety, we're restoring regulation, and we are building connection. So, yeah. Um, yes. Oh my gosh, good. I'm so glad you learned so much. I'm so glad that you can share this with your peers. Yes, definitely. And it will be on our YouTube channel. It'll be on our website with a connection and link to that. So that way you guys can share as well, with as many as you'd like. So let me let me unmute you, Joseph. Oh, Okay, you are unmuted.
Hi, my name's Joe. I actually work with Community Medical Services as a peer support, and I just want to say the presentation was beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Um, I'm very passionate about this stuff. I've used and still use a lot of these tools.
Amazing.
CBT, amazing. I've had to deal with some pretty intense PTSD. I was
Mm.
blind for a year from a bad car accident.
Oh,
So,
goodness.
I didn't get to EDMR. We actually were able to address that issue before getting to that step, but
Okay.
that is something I'm super curious about. So,
Yeah, be
that was super
curious.
cool. We
It's
brought it up.
oh, good. I'm so glad. I'm very glad. Thank you for sharing.
And I have to ask, I'm guessing you're very familiar with the Bruce Alexander experiment in the 70s with Rat Park and
Oh, yes. Yes, I
yeah,
discuss that with our clients all the time. There's
same.
so many things, that I wanted to add. I did this presentation a couple years ago in Pennsylvania, and it was a 3 hour CEU. So it was a lot for me to take my passion and my excitement down a little bit
Yeah,
to keep it to 90 minutes. So thank you.
but again, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Oh, thanks for popping my email in there, Liz. I appreciate you. Does anybody else have any questions? You'll be getting the email from me too later. So absolutely, feel free to reach out to me. It'll also have my LinkedIn connection if you'd like that. And, down at the bottom is my direct self at Wellbrook. So thank you all again. This has been so much fun, and I really appreciate your time and attention and all of your feedback. It was really, really helpful. And yeah, I hope everybody has a really great night. Bye-bye. Thank you.